So welcome to the second lecture of this week, which is the third week. So this week we've been talking about redistributive justice. So basically the idea of should we redistribute wealth. So people have certain amounts of wealth in our society, and you might think that one of the jobs of the city is to take that wealth and make it more even or put it to better use, you might think. And our question is whether this is just. So today we'll be dealing with Rawls, who wrote a very famous book in 1971 called The Theory of Justice. And this has been at the center of a lot of political philosophy, especially about the issue of justice and institutions in the latter half of the 20th century, and it still is very important today. He later wrote a revised version of this because it was part of so much commentary that he wanted to respond to this. But we're reading the original because this is what Nozick will respond to. So Nozick's book, which was written in 74, 73, I think. So they're both at Harvard. They're actually colleagues at Harvard. Nozick's book was a response to Rawls. And so Rawls is going to say that we should redistribute according to certain principles. And Nozick is going to say, no, these principles you're using are unjust. And so we're going to look at that. So this lecture will be about Rawls, and the next lecture will be about Nozick. So again, what Rawls is trying to do, and hopefully you've already read the excerpt from Rawls's book, which I've posted. You should read that before you watch the lecture, just to give you an idea of what's going on. So what Rawls is doing is he's trying to give us an idea of what sort of institutions we should have in society. So he's not concerned about personal justice. So if I do something to you personally, is that an unjust act? That's not the answer, or not the question Rawls is trying to answer. What he's concerned with is what the structure of society should be. And the way he's going to go about this is, so this is a contractualist view. And so what he's going to, and I'll describe that in a second, what he's trying to do is saying, okay, so imagine we have a hypothetical agreement between all of us. And I'll have to say why we should have this sort of hypothetical agreement and what form it takes. But, imagine we all sort of have a contract with each other. The question he's trying to answer is, what form would that contract take? And this is supposed to bind us in some way. So the sort of situation he's imagining this contract being formed, the agreement about what sort of institutions we should have, is it should take place behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. And what this means is, this is hypothetical, so we're supposed to imagine that there's a group of people who come together, and they're rational, and they're mutually disinterested. So this means that they don't care about each other's ends necessarily, and they're rational. They want to further themselves, but they're stripped of specific features that they might have that might affect what they want in life, certain things that they want in life, and it might affect what they know about what position they'll take in society. And so what he says about this, here's a quote I took, one excludes the knowledge of those contingencies which sets men at odds and allows them to be guided by their prejudices. So what he's trying to do is figure out, okay, if we're just in some sort of general setting where we don't actually know what position in society will be, we're sort of neutral regarding that, what will we decide for ourselves and each other, right? Because what we do know is that we're going to end up in society. So we wanted to decide what institutions to have so that we're best off when we end up in society. And we don't know where we'll end up. We might be rich, we might be poor, we might be extremely intelligent, we might have some sort of mental deficits, we don't know. And so what he wants to do is get rid of all of these features that affect the way we think society should be, right? This sort of self-interested ways in which we think society should be, because if we're extremely intelligent or very strong, we might have certain views about what society should be like. If we're extremely intelligent, we should think that, wow, intelligent people should get lots of money and all this. If we're really strong, we should think, well, strong people should get lots of things, lots of benefits. In a similar way, if we know we'll be of a certain social class, like if we know we'll be born to very rich people, we might say, there should be no redistribution of wealth. And if we know we'll be very poor, we should say we want total equality of income or something. So he's trying to get rid of that. So if we get rid of all those features which cause us to come into conflict with one another, and also specific ends. So we might be very religious in the world, right? We might have certain ends. We might want to build churches. We might want to pursue certain moral ends, or we might be atheists, right? We don't want to pursue certain things like that. We want to also strip ourselves of that. And so we want to be neutral between those because we don't want our institutions to decide which one of those to pursue. So this is very important. And the difference here, so what he's going to try to do here is try to find out what is the rational agreement that these people should come to. And so an important distinction here is this is a Kantian solution, so that's why it's contractualist. And that can be contrasted with a Hobbesian solution, which is contractarian. So remember when we talked about the cooperative solution, so we imagine everyone in society the way they are, right? So we imagine them not stripped of anything. What sort of agreement might they come to then? Or what would it be rational for them to agree to? That's a contractarian view. This contractualist view is looking for some features of rationality itself and then trying to build up some sort of moral issue, some conclusions about justice from rationality itself, whereas contractarianism doesn't have that. We're using some simple version of rationality and then using our ends to sort of figure out what we might agree to. So what Rawls, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a second, but Rawls only assumes that individuals are going to prefer primary social goods and prefer more than less. And so that's what he's building his view upon, is that preference, not some sort of preference for, chocolate cake over broccoli or something, right? Or preferences for living in the suburbs over living in the city or something like that. He only has these very basic features, primary social goods, which we'll talk about in a second. So, so what he's trying, using this hypothetical veil of ignorance and this agreement behind it, he's trying to figure out what rationality itself dictates we say about our institutions and what would be just. And so that is very important. So, so Rawls is concerned with institutions. What are these? So here's a quote from page 55. I don't think this was part of your reading. Yeah, I don't think it was. Oh, maybe it was. So he says a public system of rules which defines offices and positions with their rights and duties, powers, immunities, and the like. These rules specify certain forms of action as permissible, others as forbidden, and they provide for certain penalties and offenses and so on when violations occur. As examples of institutions or more generally social practices, we may think of games and rituals, trials and parliaments, markets and systems of property. That will be the important one for us and for Nozick. So I've placed an emphasis on that on the slide. So this is very broad, right? So by institutions, he's not just saying political institutions, right? So he's not just saying that we have a Justice Department or something, or that we have a Supreme Court. He's also talking about the very practices we place around property. So the fact that we have certain property rights. These are things we are going to have to decide. So we could have institutions which said people should not have property rights. So when you work in a certain way, you might not have a right to the fruits of your labor, so to speak. This might need to be redistributed to various people to make things just. And so he's not assuming that those things are just parts of justice initially. These are the sort of institutions that we need to decide whether, which ones we should have. So remember that this is pretty much all. So institutions include all the practices we do in society, all the sort of things we do, all the rules we have, and that's what he's concerned with. He's trying to figure out which are the just institutions. How should we form our society? So the first step for Rawls, and this is the step we're going to concentrate on, is to decide which principles should determine which institutions we should form. So later in the book, Rawls talks about the specific sort of institutions we might derive from these principles, but he gives two principles, first of all, that guide what we should choose. And what we should choose based upon these principles will vary based upon our situation. So different societies or different societies existing within different conditions, maybe different cultures, perhaps, might choose different institutions, but these principles should stay the same. And so the first principle is the liberty principle. And this is going to be the most important principle. So there's two, and this is the primary, what he calls. And so I use here the final formulation that he gives. It's very similar to earlier formulations that you have read. This comes later in the book. So basically, as he goes through the book, he refines his formulations. But the differences between what occurs in the reading that I gave you and this are not important, but I just decided to give you this one, which is the last one. This is the one he decides upon. So essentially, the liberty principle says that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties, compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. So everyone should have certain liberties, and these will be, I'll explain them in a second, but these are generally going to be like liberties of conscience, free speech, certain other things like that we typically, we describe as the basic liberties of Western society or Western democracies, liberal democracies. And this is the most important, so that these exist for people. So the second principle, so the first principle is pretty uncontroversial, so at least it'll be uncontroversial for Nozick. The second principle is what will be controversial, especially the part A here, or the difference principle. So the second principle will be equality of opportunity in the difference principle. So this says that social and economic inequalities, and remember, because these institutions are dealing with so many diverse things in society, these will encompass most of what we exist. So these would be anything you get, basically. So any sort of inequality, any sort of economic inequality, any sort of different rights according to your station, right? So, if you are president of the United States, that gives you certain rights that a common citizen doesn't have. It also gives you certain obligations. If you're a CEO of a company, you have certain rights that others don't have. If you're very rich, you have certain rights. Given the amount of money, you can, basically request people to do certain things if they want to. You can have more things. You have this money which you can give to people, and then in trade, and gain other things which a poor person doesn't, that's not available to them. So these are inequalities of any sort like that. So they're to be arranged such that these two things are true. To the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, consistent with the just savings principle. And so we'll talk about the just savings principle. So basically, any inequalities must benefit the least advantaged, and it must benefit them the greatest. And so we'll discuss this in detail later. And then B, so the first thing A is the difference principle. The second thing B is the equality of opportunity principle. So these inequalities are attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So we'll get back to the second principle, but let's go into some detail about the first principle. So the most important feature of our institutions are that they guarantee certain rights. So liberty of conscience, freedom of speech, political liberties, rule of law, these sorts of things, the right to vote, center political liberties, the right to hold office, that everyone can hold office regardless of certain features of them, right? How much money they have or whatever. And so these are not just formal rights, right? So, it's not just them being on the books that matter. So it must actually be the case that similar citizens have similar opportunities. So if two citizens have the same intelligence, same education, they should have an equal opportunity to achieve in various ways. Same in all these different ways. More down to earth. If two people, right, have similar academic records in high school, similar intelligences, similar social abilities, one should not be forced to go to a bad public school or something, or a cheap school, right, and the other allowed to go to a very expensive school where they'll have opportunities after this point, right? So in these sorts of cases, there should be equal opportunities. Basically, class should not matter, right? So we shouldn't sort of differentiate things based upon class when people have equal ability. So this takes priority over the second principle. So this is the most important thing. And we're mostly going to leave this aside for now, because most people accept something like this. It seems very right to us that this should be the case in our institutions. Where there will be differences, I think, will be in the second principle. So we generally think, and this is what, going back to the education issue, people generally think that people should have equal abilities to obtain an education, and that's why we have government subsidized loans and such, and that seems to be a principle most people think is important. Do you have a right to go to a private school? That might not be the case, as long as public schools are offering something very similar to what the private school is, at least in cases of opportunities. And that's sort of true in the U.S., so is generally true. And so let's just put that aside, because most people sort of agree with something like this. So let's start first with the second principle and the equality principle. So basically, those with equal ability, so this comes from, remember the quote from the 2 slides ago, people of equal abilities should have equal opportunity. So as I was saying, positions in education, educational institutions should not be restricted based upon what family you're a part of, or positions of authority, right? So it used to be the case that there were different types of sort of positions that people could have within governments, and some of these were only open to the aristocracy. So you had to be of a certain class to be in that position. What Rawls says is no, this can't be the case. We would not agree to this in the original position behind the veil, right? So what we would agree to is that people would have equal opportunity to pursue positions in various places, so to gain these social positions, as long as they had equal abilities and equal features. And of course, they had different abilities that you don't need to have equal opportunity to pursue these positions. The best person should get the position. But among people of equal abilities, there should be this equal opportunity. And okay, so this will take precedence or priority over the difference principle, which will come next. So this, dealing with equality of opportunities of those with similar abilities, will take precedence over the redistributive aspect, which is contained within the difference principle. So that's important to understand. So the difference principle is sort of last. So the first principle took priority over the second principle, and within the second principle, the equality principle takes precedent over the difference principle. So the second part of the second principle deals with the distribution of goods to individuals within the society. So the first part of the second principle dealt with the distribution of positions. And that seemed less controversial because it seems, plausible that people of equal merit should have equal opportunity to get certain positions. The second principle will be more controversial because this says that any advantages that some members of society obtain through a certain distribution of goods should only be allowed if it is to the advantage of the least well-off. So this is even the case when these advantages are gained through natural abilities of those individuals. So we can imagine that there is some set of the population that is just more intelligent, more driven, more hardworking, all these great things that allow for success. Even for them, their obtaining more goods requires that the least well-off is better off. Okay, so that's the essential part of the principle. What limits this? Well, the only limiting thing is that society is able to save money or save resources and goods for future generations. And so what we don't want to happen, or what Rawls doesn't want to happen, is for us to have a certain distribution that is to the betterment of the least well-off now, but which handicaps the future generations. So that is not what we want. So there is some obligation to put aside things for future generations, but still this is going to be a dramatic redistributive project. So how is this justified? Well, remember, we're behind the veil of ignorance, and Rawls thinks that if we respect persons, or if the people behind the veil of ignorance respect persons, and they don't know which persons they'll be, right, they will agree to this sort of thing. Because you don't want to end up, right, as this least well-off person, and you have a chance of ending up the least well-off person, and being disadvantaged as someone else gains a lot more. So because you don't know any features of yourself, you don't know the probability of you ending up as any given person in society, it's a possibility that you'll end up as the least well-off. And so you'll avoid this by producing a distribution that would give you benefits as well. So it's important to understand what we'll be doing in this case. So what is the project that Rawls has us do to decide which distribution is best? It's going to be something different from what Nozick is doing. So Nozick will call this a patterned sort of view, whereby we look at all the possible distributions of goods that might be out in the world, and those distributions will be produced by certain institutions, right? And then different institutions might produce different distributions. So we look at the distribution, we pick the distribution that follows our rule, and then from that we decide which institutions we should have. This is sort of a common thing among sort of modern liberals, not classical liberals, who think that there's something good about certain types of distribution of goods, usually wealth, right? And the libertarian view, which Nozick will advance, says that's wrong. So when we look at what's just, we can't look at the distribution. Distributions themselves are not just. They don't tell us any part of the issue of justice. What he thinks is what's going on to produce that distribution is what tells us what's just. And so we can't tell whether a situation is just by looking at distribution. We have to look at how we got there. And so we'll deal with that next week. But so here's the rule that Rawls uses. So we maximize the goods of individuals, starting with the worst off person. And for cases where the goods are equal, right? So there's equal primary social goods for the worst people between two types of distributions. We move to the next best off. So and then we continue this until we reach the best off. So here's the sort of thing that they have in mind. So you saw these in the reading. They might have been very confusing. They're very confusing at first. So first of all, so what is this? So these are graphs of primary amount of primary social goods. So this is the primary social goods scale. So being higher on the primary social goods scale is better, right? And each one of these curves is a person. So let's imagine we have 3 people in our society. So of course in a real society this will be very complex. You might also think of these as groups of people, classes or something. And they each have certain social good curves. So, okay, the y-axis is social goods. The x-axis is just a list, they're lined up of possible distributions. So don't think of this as like a progression through time or something like that. Supposedly there will be some relation between, that forms a curve like this, right? Otherwise you wouldn't get a curve. But you could resort this x-axis in any way you want it, and it wouldn't change the task that we're left with. The task is to find the best distribution. So for instance, each vertical line is a distribution, right? So this is a distribution. So, it has the sort of yellow person, the person on the bottom, with this amount of primary good. The black line, person represented by the black line has this amount of good, and the person represented by this grayish sort of line has this amount of good. So that is the distribution. So what we do, we find the maximum points. Right, so this is the first thing we do is we find these maximum points. And then according to Rawls' rule, first we look to the worst off, which is the yellow line. So this person is the worst off. And we find their best case, right? So what is the best distribution for them? Well, it's there. So it's where this black line is. And so this is the just distribution. And you notice that this is off of the peaks for both the black line and the gray line. So even though they are decreasing, because this is the best case for the yellow line, this is what it is just to choose. Next we could consider a different case where the yellow line, or the person represented by the yellow line, has 2 points where they're best off. So here I already have the little dots on there, but you see that there's 2 peaks to the yellow curve. And so then, because there's 2 points at which the yellow line is best off, they're equal, we move next to the next best off, right, which is going to be the black line. And so we have a choice, right? We have a choice between this distribution going through that line, or going through this dot, and this distribution. And because the black line is better for that distribution, where the black line has just gone through, the vertical black line, that is the distribution we should use. So so you see, we need to only consider the better off groups, or the better off people, once the best benefit of the worst off has been maximized. So, looking at these curves, so these are the curves Rawls uses, you'll notice that they're linked in a certain way, so that he calls them chain links. And so generally what he thinks is that as the best off people do better, right, generally this will also make others below them in how they're doing better off as well. And this is the rationale for any sort of inequality. So this is the, it's kind of like a trickle down sort of idea. Not quite though. But if you offer the sort of like best performing individuals, or the most talented, the smartest people, these incentives that yes, you can have these goods, you can have more goods than others if you do more stuff, if you do better, this will actually help all of society. And this is like an efficiency condition, right? So if we actually mandated equality, we would be down here, is his thought. And so the reason why we need to require that or allow inequality is because as the better off people improve their position in society and improve the number of goods they have, so will the worst off improve. So this is an assumption about how economics works. And it's important to notice that if this is not true, so this is contingent upon certain facts about economics, certain facts about how societies work. If this is not true, we end up with a rather different theory, but we can find the just distribution in the same way. So here's a case where, it's a zero-sum game, in a sense, right? So here I just included two people. So there's this one person and this other person. And so as we go through these distributions, as the better off improves, the worst off is made worse off, right? So in a sense, this would be a sort of society where there's just one pot of goods, right? And people take what they can from that. And there isn't really this production of goods. So allowing certain people more things doesn't actually produce more for others as well. So society in general is not improved. In fact, this is probably drawn a little, not completely accurate. But if you look, pretend that these curves are identical except mirrors of each other. We have one set of goods, right? And they're being split up, right? So you can imagine we might have 100 goods, and every time this person gets one, this person loses one. And that's exactly what a zero-sum game is. And so if society is like that, some people think that's what society is like, or if it's kind of like this, then the only just distribution is perfect equality. Because the line, you can barely see it on the edge there, the vertical line I've drawn, is the point where the worst off is the best off, right? Which is the point where the two people are equal. So this is the conclusion we must draw if allowing people certain inequalities, or allowing people to achieve more than others, or get more than others in way of goods, does not produce overall betterment of society. This is what we have. Then we would require perfect equality. So I just sort of said goods, right? So we're dividing goods and distributing goods. So what are these things? You might think many different things. What is good for one person, you might think someone else might not value at all. So Rawls recognized this. This is sort of a classic problem in sort of determining what a person's well-being or what a person's utility will be if they're given certain goods. So there's these concerns that some people may be capable of achieving a lot of utility, like they're very, very happy by very few goods, right? And they get even happier and happier if you give them more goods. Whereas others might barely improve at all. They might slightly improve their happiness or utility or whatever if you give them a lot of goods. And so the concern is, does this make us think that we should give all of our stuff to the people who are easily made happy and who are made happy more and more as they get more stuff? Or should we distribute it equally? It's unclear. So Rawls thinks he doesn't have to worry about this. So he thinks the difference principle sort of gets rid of this issue. First of all, this is somewhat technical, but he thinks that we can just think of order of well-being, or so all we need to be concerned with is who is the worst off, right? So who look at society, who is doing the worst. We pick them out, and then decide, okay, from that, what should our distribution be? So all we need to do is pick out the worst off, and then the slightly better off and the better off, right? That's all we need. We don't need to compare utilities in some sort of complex way. We just need to pick out who's worst off, and then who's best off, and then who's in between, in various degrees. And that might be a lot easier than actually like comparing utility along some sort of cardinal scale, which is what's called, assigning numbers to them. So he just thinks that all we need to do is apply an ordinal scale. So this is all we need to really be concerned with. Okay. So next, he thinks that it also solves an issue because he has a way of answering what we should redistribute, and what should we maximize for those who are the worst off. Well, primary social goods. So these are goods that help one achieve your ends, regardless of what those ends are. And remember that we're behind a veil of ignorance when we're sort of figuring out what sort of principles we should have. And one thing that the sort of entities or people, they're sort of weird in that they don't have our features, so we might not think of them as people, but they're rational agents. And they know that people want more primary social goods. So regardless of your ends, you'll want these primary social goods. And these are sort of what you might expect, like food and various, just anything that can help you, regardless of what your ends are. And so, sort of alluding to what we'll talk about later this week, it seems plausible that adequate housing and transportation, so the ability to have a place to sleep, have a place to sort of do anything that you're doing, and moving about, so transportation, seem like plausible candidates for primary social goods, right? So it seems like Rawls is talking about exactly the sort of thing we're concerned with. And so it seems like, yes, he is advocating for redistribution of goods such that people who are worst off actually do well compared to other possible distributions. So you might be concerned at this point about this view, and there's some natural reasons to be concerned about the view. First of all, and this is where things are sort of centered, the criticisms of the difference principle. Our natural abilities, right, or the things we've, even the properties of ourselves that we've created for ourselves do not belong solely to us. So the fruits of our labor are not ours. So if you're really smart and you do certain things, you don't get to fully determine what you do with, the things you produce. It's required that you redistribute, or you allow goods to be redistributed if it's going to benefit those who are the least benefited. And so, so he seems to link, and he does link, us to others in society. So we have obligations to other people in society to share with them in certain ways. So we need to share the things we've obtained in the form of this redistribution of wealth. It's not the case, so this is how he's going to differ substantially from Nozick. It's not the case that you can just be thought to exist on your own, have right to your own property, have right to all your capabilities, trading people for things, fair trades with, for people with things, and then, you have a right to everything you trade for, right, because you traded it for it with either your work or things that you made or whatnot, right? So that's not Rawls's view. Nozick will have that sort of view, where he cares most about property rights and fair trade. Rawls thinks, no, we're linked to others in society. I mean, this is why the going behind the veil of ignorance with others and being stripped of all our features that are relevant to how successful we'll be is the way we do this, right? Is the way we figure out the just distribution. Rawls wants to take those features out of it, out of the sort of decision process. And, in this way, essentially natural assets are equated with things like inheritance and natural resources. So he thinks that your intelligence, your strength, your self-control, how much drive you have, these are all features that you get through luck, right? You don't, certainly there's factors, your parents will determine like their genetics and how they raise you will determine some of these features, but you didn't do anything to achieve them, right? So you didn't do anything to gain them. And because of this, he thinks of these natural assets as just like something else that you don't do anything to obtain, inheritance, right? So natural assets are similar to inheritance, and this way are subject to not redistribution of those assets, because that's impossible, but rather making sure that the fruits you gain from these assets, so the goods, the primary social goods you obtain from these assets, are only gained with the improvement of those who are worst off. So, you gaining things from these assets is linked to how others in society do, and you can't get sort of free benefits from them, right? So, in a sense, you don't own them, right? So they aren't yours entirely; they're subject to social constraints. So this we just might think is wrong. We might just think that natural assets are very different from inheritance. They're who we are, right? So they make up who we are. And Rawls doesn't think so. So take this seriously. This is a very dramatic view, and it gets. So what it does is it achieves a justification for a very substantial redistribution system. So an institution that redistributes a lot of wealth, and that's what a lot of people think is necessary. But it might be at a substantial cost. We might not believe it, that believe this is true, that we should treat natural assets this way. So next time we will look at Nozick's libertarian objections to Rawls. He'll present a theory it's quite a bit simpler, so it'll be easier to understand, and it's pretty intuitive. It sort of is derived kind of from a Lockean view, basically that we have certain property rights to our property, and then we make just trades of that property with other things, and then we have the rights to those things as well. So as long as the trades are just, there's no theft going on, the resultant distribution of wealth is itself just. So what he'll object to Rawls, or how he'll object to Rawls, is that we can't just look at a distribution and decide whether it's just or not, right? We need to look at what happens to create the distribution. And he thinks that the distributions we pick using Rawls' method will be unjust, because they require us to, often steal from the rich and give to the poor, and that is unjust. Okay, so this will allow us to, this will give us sort of a counterattack against Rawls' view that seems to give us the ability to have public housing, have public transit, even though we're taxing the rich more. It seems like Rawls allows us to do this. Nozick will not, likely. And okay, so that'll be next time. That'll be in the next few days, and then your exam is due on Sunday, so you'll probably be working on that a lot. So this week will be overlapping with next week a little bit, and next week might be a little shorter. And so the lectures about housing and transit might not come until early next week. Okay, so I'll see you later.